Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1233 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Wednesday evening into Thursday. And thank you for joining us on the podcast, as always, and making Locked On Hawks your first listen each and every day. Check us out on all podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and, of course, YouTube. Today's podcast will be myself and Ben Ladner, friend of the podcast, part 2 of 2. If you missed it, part 1 dropped earlier this week with Ben and I talking about the NBA playoffs and sort of a broad look at what's going on in the postseason. Part 2 today that you're about to listen to right now is more Hawks related. We talked about the end of the season for the Hawks, Hawks Heat, how that all went, obviously in not great fashion for the Hawks, as well as what it tells us about the future for Atlanta, problems that Ben might have seen from the Hawks roster, what could be changing in the future, what they have to do, what they possibly could do, all of the other factors in play with the Hawks. We'll have all kinds of conversations about this with different guests along the way, but Ben is very, very smart and is plugged into the Hawks and the entire NBA, so a fun conversation ahead with Ben. One note here at the top of the podcast, there's a little bit of news that actually dropped on Tuesday into Wednesday. Madonovich finished number 6 in the 6th Man of the Year voting for the Atlanta Hawks. Obviously, not a podium finish there for Bogey, but I think a deserving inclusion in the top 6 probably would have been a little bit higher for me, honestly. But there you go on that. At least a member of the Hawks sort of landed on the awards voting somewhere along the way in the NBA realm. So that's it for as far as the news portion is concerned. Not a whole lot going on in Hawks land, but still the draft is coming, so we'll have more draft content later this week and the next week, etc. We'll have wall-to-wall coverage of the offseason, and that includes today's podcast with myself and Ben Ladner. So after you hear the intro, it'll be myself and Ben talking about the Hawks, the Heat matchup, and much more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
I am joined once again by a friend of the podcast, Ben Ladner, who is back for something of a part 2. Not dropping these episodes back to back, but you're listening to this podcast later in the week. And Ben and I talked about the NBA playoffs on Tuesday, and we're back talking about more on the actual Atlanta Hawks on this episode. Ben, welcome back.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So we covered a lot of ground in the last episode, kind of sprinkled some Hawks talk in there along the way because we just have to go back to the Hawks somewhere along the way. But I want to start kind of narrow with how you thought the Hawks played in the Miami series, obviously not particularly well. And then we'll kind of zoom out from there and get into some big picture stuff as well. I want to start with the Hawks offense because that was sort of the talking point for me and for most people in the playoffs. They just could not score in the series against Miami. And I'll say this probably a number of times, but all credit to Miami for playing great defense in that series. They were awesome. But the Hawks scored about 104 points per 100 possessions in that series, which would be like a league worst figure after being number 2 in the league in regular season. That obviously is the headliner. I won't even lead you anywhere. What did you see from the Hawks offense against Miami, and what was sort of concerning about that or not concerning about that for a big picture?
Yeah, well, it did not look good, like you said.
Thank you. That'll be it. That's it for us, everybody. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks. We'll see you next time. A bit of a slog. I mean, I think Miami's switching defense was really good. I mean, Bam Adebayo is one of the best, maybe the best switching big man in the NBA. He certainly was that in this series. He stayed in front of Trae Young really well. Miami's other defenders just, they're just a team of really good, solid, versatile, athletic defensive players. And that's what this series kind of was. From I guess for the Hawks perspective, it's sort of similar, I guess, to kind of what we talked about with Luka and the Mavs against the Suns, where like playing through this one guy all of the time on offense maybe isn't as effective in the playoffs as it is in the regular season because defenses can get used to that. It's sort of like facing a pitcher who throws 100 miles an hour every pitch. Like eventually the hitter's going to time that up and he's going to figure out, where, like what location you want, what speed is coming and, be able to hit it. So I think there was probably a little bit of that for Atlanta. They could probably stand to diversify their offense, not only in these playoffs, but I think all season. It's hard to say that a team with the second best offense in the NBA should change anything, but like, this is why you do it, right? Is like you want to have other things that you can do offensively rather than just let's have this one guy run a pick and roll or attack in isolation. Because if the opponent knows that's coming, they're going to scheme for that. They're going to be in places that you're not expecting. They're going to help from different places. They're going to force guys like Kevin Huerter and Bogdan Bogdanovich to beat you, and they couldn't, and like part of that too is like I heard Ben Taylor talking about this on his podcast as well. Like for if you're Kevin Herter, the shots that you're getting as a secondary guy when the defense is loaded up on Trae in the postseason are different from the shots you get as a secondary guy in the regular season when all your looks are like off of swing passes and kickouts and they're easy looks. Now you're shooting earlier in the shot clock. You're being maybe even like dared to shoot, and there's like a little more pressure on you because like, okay, yeah, we'll live with you shooting, and you're going to have to do it from different places on the floor, different areas of the shot clock, things like that. And like that can, I mean, that's not the only reason the Hawks lost, but like little things like that when you're just in a different offensive flow can make even the same shots feel different because you're just taking them under a different context. I think there was a little bit of that at play in this series, and again, just like Trae Young not being able to do anything against what is admittedly a really good defense. It's like when everything is built around this one guy, and this one guy can't do what he typically does, and you don't have any other options, like that's a tough place to be, and that's kind of where the Hawks ended up.
Yeah, that's the result. And obviously that is, I'm not saying it's been a concern, it's been a talking point for the entirety of the Trae Young era. It's also a talking point beyond the Hawks on this. Like there's the ever persistent conversation about the heliocentric offenses. We talked about one of the last podcasts with Luka Doncic in Dallas. Like that's obviously those guys are leaguing for a number of reasons, but James Harden's another discussion point back in Houston. It's not just those guys. Like there's been a discussion about like if you can do that at the highest level and whether it works at the highest level. And clearly for the Hawks having only one guy, and part of it is that he just didn't play well. That also plays into this. Miami gets credit for it for sure, but Trae should have been better than he was in the series, and he was terrible. I mean, that's worth pointing out as well. But yeah, it goes into those like, does he need more help? Yes. Could he play better? Yes. It's like all these things mashed up into one. It's a 5-game sample, and you're playing against a team that's the number 1 seed, and you're not the number 1 seed, and all those things. But I do think that the scheme versatility that Miami had, the way they defended him physically, and it was just kind of striking to see. I'm not sure. I mean, obviously you weren't watching it the same way I was, but kind of the passive nature of what Trae had in the series as well. Like he kind of, I'm not saying he gave up, but it was like he stopped trying to get to the rim at some point. Like he just kind of, he was trying, he'd do his move or two, and then he was kind of just settling for jumpers. And that's part of the deal when you're 6'1", but usually he's very aggressive and hunting and trying to get to the rim, get to his floater, etc. And the way he was being defended, and also just the way maybe he just got worn down by the series as well. But by game 4, game 5, it was just a lot of like floating. He didn't take a lot of shots in those games. And it was striking to see an entire playoff series where Trae Young averaged 37 minutes a game. He didn't take the most shots in the series for the Hawks. That's insane. The fact that, I mean, obviously it's 1-game samples are different, but DeAndre Hunter took more field goal attempts than Trae Young did in the playoffs. Wow. Like that's remarkable. Now, part of that was that game 5, Hunter took 30 shots or whatever it was. But yeah, I mean, obviously Trae took more free throw attempts. So if you want to factor that all in, it's probably leaning slightly to Trae. But in terms of field goal attempts, I believe that Hunter took at least, I think maybe 2 more shots than Trae did. 1 more shot. So Hunter took 70 shots in 5 games. Trae took 69 shots in 5 games. So like that's striking on itself. Like for him to have the usage that he has and to not even average 14 shot attempts a game in the playoffs, that's also weird. So I'm not even sure what the takeaway is, Ben, and I'm not even sure what I've just said. But it's one of those things where like there was so much going on to where I have a hard time, and I watched every game twice, pinpointing like exactly what happened because it was a mix of all those things.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it was just kind of odd to see. I mean, it's like Trae Young was pretty good against the Bucks last year when he was healthy, which was a great defense. And so
yeah, a different defense, but he's certainly, I mean, obviously last year, and man, I am so glad on some level about this, because if this had been his first playoffs and he played like this, the conversation would be horrible. The dialogue would be horrible. And I think you and I would be on the let's not panic about this side, most likely, because it's 5 games. But I did try to imagine, like, if he did not have that playoff series, the playoffs last year, the three series where he was pretty much awesome in 2 of the 3, and then he had a couple of games against Milwaukee too. Man, if this was it, if this is the first time he's in the playoffs, it would be insufferable. It really would be.
Yeah, I'm glad for everyone's sake that we're not in that situation.
Everyone's sake. And Trae's, because I don't believe this is indicative of what he's going to be in the playoffs now. Like that'd be silly to say.
Right.
I'm sure someone said that somewhere, but like, I don't think that's true. I mean, I think Trey's a superstar and he's not going to have this kind of issue, but maybe it's a wake up call for everybody, both him and the team. Like, okay, we didn't run into a switching scheme for the most part last year. And we saw it in the playoffs. We saw it in the regular season a little bit. And McMillan talked about that a lot throughout the grind of the regular season. Like, they've seen every defense, but seeing it in the regular season versus seeing it over 5 games against a really good defense in the playoffs that's built basically to stop you is different, as we found out.
Yeah. And I think another thing we saw was once Trey was like kind of neutralized, like early on in games, he would start to press and take bad shots and force the issue and turn the ball over. And, and like that's, he's not the only guy that does that. A lot of players who are used to scoring, who aren't scoring in a particular game, will kind of resort to that just to get going. And it did work. Was it game 3 when he hit the game-winning floater, or game 4, whatever it was? Like, eventually he did kind of get it going in that game, but for the most part, it kind of just resulted in him taking bad shots that weren't really going in. And then that came at the expense of his teammates getting better shots. It came at the expense of the Hawks transition defense, because Miami's able to get the rebound or get the live ball turnover and go the other way. And, maybe we shouldn't be so harsh, given that ultimately it is an 8 seed losing in 5 games to a 1 seed. That's not altogether unusual. But I think, it is right to point out that the way the Hawks looked in this series, because you would expect, like my expectation coming in was, okay, like the Hawks will be able to score reasonably well. Their offense will keep them in the game, but their defense is just going to fall apart. They're not going to be able to keep up with Miami's continuity and their screening and passing and all that. But that really wasn't it. It's like their offense, which was supposed to be their strength, was really the thing that struggled. And maybe that's what you're talking about with these heliocentric guys. It just doesn't translate in the same way to the postseason because of what we said earlier, just the keying in and the ability to game plan a little bit more intensely. But whatever the reason, there's some stuff to figure out for the Hawks offensively. And I will say, I mean, while we're here, I didn't think Nate McMillan was the most creative offensive coach in this series. He probably could have run some better stuff in the half court to get better shots. We don't necessarily need to go all the way down that road, because I know Hawks fans are.
No, I was gonna ask you about Nate too along the way, but yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. To not have the Fire Nate conversation on this podcast, because I'll probably do that on my own along the way, because there's been a lot of questions about it and mailbags, and I'm sure I'll get into all that stuff later. But at a bare minimum, I think it is probably known before the series started. As I said, I know I said it, and then after the series ended, the Hawks were at a very large coaching mismatch in that series, which didn't help matters. And by the way, that's credit to Spoelstra, who's awesome. So it wasn't like Nate was going against just a random somebody. Spoelstra's a top 5 guy in the league. So
the Sixers, by the way, also at a big coaching disadvantage in the second round.
Yeah, honestly, Doc Rivers and Nate McMillan have a lot of similarities in a lot of ways.
They do.
They've been around for a long time. Obviously, Doc has a title, which changes things. He's a lot more famous than Nate McMillan is, but they do have a lot of similarities. I'm not even sure who I think is a better coach, which says something about both of them, I guess. I'm not really sure what to say about that, but they're very similar. Okay, before we get to some stuff about the defense and actually some team building aspects, I want to ask you some big picture questions about what the Hawks need in the future. But first, a word from our sponsors on the podcast today. Today's podcast is brought to you by BetOnline, and of course, it's now into the month of May, and baseball season is up and running at full steam, and of course, that means the NBA playoffs are also here with a jam-packed slate of games almost every night across the sporting landscape for the next couple of weeks and months. With that in mind, BetOnline.net is the number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information. This year, they have the latest odds, contests, player props, futures, exotics, and much more. And really, it's the best spot in the sports world for all the latest developments, including podcasts and reviews for all of the leagues this season. Not just basketball or baseball either. BetOnline is the continued source for all the sports wagering information that you need and all the needs that you could possibly have anyway, really even beyond sports, including live betting and your favorite casino games. BetOnline also has odds on other sports. That includes golf and esports, tennis, auto racing, horse racing, hockey, MMA, boxing, soccer, cricket, entertainment bets, and much more. And it's always time. It's always fun, even for me, to look ahead of the futures market. That includes the NFL, college football. All those sports are not in season right now, but there's always something to bet on at betonline.net. Head to the website right now on your computer, mobile device to learn more about all the trends and the action across the sports world. And just visit BetOnline today. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Ben. You mentioned the defense briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on this necessarily, but I do wonder like what you made of the defense because clearly part of the issue on offense too was that the Hawks didn't have their bigs at full strength. John Collins, Clint Capella not being themselves in that series made them to be drawing dead on both ends of the floor in a lot of ways. Okongwu had a great game 3 when they won. He was a huge part of that and played great, but he's still a rookie. Not a rookie, second year player, had some second year player moments. But I wonder what you made of it because like Miami's offense, I wasn't necessarily a full believer in. I'm still not necessarily a believer in it at the highest levels, but for the most part, they got what they needed to get against the Hawks. Not a huge surprise, but it's kind of crazy now as I think about this, as I'm saying it out loud, how much more time we spent on the Hawks offense struggling the defense because offensively they've been good for a long time. Defensively, they were really bad. And it wasn't like they were great defensively in the series, but I actually had less of a problem with the defense kind of throughout. Not that they were shutting them down, but they didn't have like these huge gaping breakdowns. It's more like fundamentals. Like they just don't have the guys necessarily.
Yeah, 113, 114 offense or defensive rating, whatever it was in this series, is not terrible.
I think you take that, honestly. If I told you that before the series, I think you probably have to take it if you're the Hawks.
Yeah.
It
just
didn't matter.
But I mean, like you're saying, it's not it wasn't really any one thing defensively. It's just like Miami's offense, and I agree with you. I think at the highest levels against the best defenses, I am kind of skeptical of their offense because they don't have that like 3-level pick and roll scorer, unless you want to count Tyler Hero, which I don't really. But Miami's offense is sort of designed to take advantage of a defense like the Hawks because Trae Young is obviously very bad at the point of attack. Kevin Huerter is fine in certain scenarios, but when he has to guard Jimmy Butler a lot, he's less fine. Bogdanovich, same deal, probably a little worse than Huerter defensively, but not killing you on his own. But it's just when you have all three of those guys as your backcourt rotation, that hurts. DeAndre Hunter is good, but Capella not being healthy for most of the series, John Collins not being healthy. It's just like the continuity and the screening and the movement, both ball and player movement that the Heat run against a team like the Hawks, who is not the most disciplined and connected and communicative defense. That stuff is eventually just you're eventually going to get a wide open layup or a wide open three because someone's going to miss a rotation. Someone's going to not be where they're supposed to on defense. There's going to be some kind of breakdown, and the Heat are masterful at exploiting defensive breakdowns. That's kind of what their offense is predicated on. So like that matchup, that was my take kind of coming into the series, was that the Hawks defense, like it's not even so much the personnel as much as it is just like the way they play defense and the lack of real like high level discipline defensively was just not going to lead to good results against Miami. And it actually worked out better than I expected. But I think we still saw a lot of those instances where it's like, okay, they run a weak side screening action. They run something else on the strong side. Eventually someone gets lost. Player X like loops through to the corner. He's wide open, or like someone's open on a roll to the basket because, whoever it was didn't rotate from the weak side. And like now they're getting a dunk. And it's like those kinds of things. It's as more than it is like, okay, Jimmy Butler drove by Trae Young in isolation for the 5th time,
Yeah, I think I think that's all fair. And I think they played reasonably well defensively, especially when you account for the fact that Capella wasn't Capella in capital letters physically. Same thing with Collins. Like I said a number of times in like March and April that the Hawks actually missed Collins more defense than offense. And part of that's who he was replaced by, and that's Gallo, and Gallo's defensively is not good.
I forgot to even mention him, but
yeah.
Not the most.
Yeah, the fundamentals of having to play lineups with Trae and Gallo together like a lot is just, I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it too much, but when you have those two guys playing together, you just cannot construct a good defense. I mean, maybe if they were playing with pick your 3 elite defenders together, maybe you get by with that. But in the playoffs, maybe not. I mean, having 2 weaknesses like that, it almost doesn't matter who you're playing with. You're going to have some issues. And Miami's smart enough to sort of attack that stuff. So that's certainly appropriate. I want to zoom out a little bit and ask you sort of a bridge question. And this is sort of an odd framing as well. But I was asked this the other day, and I thought about it before, but it kind of set me back on my heels when I was asked on a radio hit. And the question basically is, how good are the Hawks right now today with this roster? And I think the consensus the way that I put it is like somewhere between last year and this year. and I kind of never bought that they were as good as they were last year. I don't think most people bought it, to be honest with you. I thought they were probably closer to where they were level wise in the playoffs. They did play great at times in the playoffs, but like I'll just leave it there. Like how good are they right now? Before we talk about like the roster turn, because they're going to have some roster moves, I think. But with their current roster this year, take out injuries, take out whatever you want to say. Like how good were the Hawks in your mind in terms of just like team quality?
Man,
It's tough. I know. It's like
yeah. I mean, I like you. I agree. It's somewhere between last year and this year. The big variable to me is Capella or Okongwu, whoever is going to be your defensive anchor, your starting center of the future or the next year or two. That's kind of what this hinges on, because like we've said, offensively they were really good this year. They just couldn't stop anyone. If they'd had, I guess now 2 years ago, that defense with this year's offense, that might be a top 6 seed in the East. I mean, that's a really good team. But when you have the 28th ranked defense or whatever they were in defensive rating this year, it almost doesn't matter how good your offense is, especially in the playoffs, because you're like a great offense. It seems like a great offense is maybe more likely to be neutralized than a great defense is to be covered up against a really good team like Miami. So,
well,
I mean, that's
there's
always
the
going
whole
to be
thing about like how bad they actually were defensively. Like, I don't believe this roster is the 4th worst defense in the league. I
right.
really don't.
I
mean,
agree.
they're not good. I want to stress that. Like, it's not a good defensive roster. But if you tell me like sim the season again, I don't think they're going to finish 27th. I really don't. Especially if Capella's alive for most of the season. Like, he's really good. But like they did it. They were as bad as the numbers are, and that you kind of are what you are in terms of the numbers. I do think that their personnel has some issues defensively that are very obvious, but also just have to be said over and over again. Like there's always this question about like defense is all about effort, Ben. People always say that, but like you have to have effort, no question. But at the end of the day, we can objectively look as people who watch the league and say, look, this Hawks roster defensively is not very good. They have some defensive challenges. They have a couple guys who are really good defenders. Like Capella's really good, obviously. Okongwu is already pretty good and will be even better in the future. Hunter has the tools to be pretty good defensively, obviously at a bare minimum. DeLon Wright, they have some guys, but like you have the aforementioned Trey, you have the aforementioned Gallo. Herter, I think, is underrated defensively, but isn't a huge plus either. Like he's just fine.
Yeah.
Bogey, I thought was pretty bad this season defensively overall. So yeah, I mean that's all your guys that you're playing. I mean Collins is, I think, again, probably a little bit underrated, but still not a huge plus. Just more of like a solid, pretty good guy. So like limitations when you have 2 glaring weaknesses plus some other semi weaknesses, it's tough. I mean, you have to build your team the way you build your team, and you're starting from a place where Trae Young's your best player. That's always gonna put you behind the 8 ball. But like we got to be honest about the roster. It's not great defensively before you get into anything else.
Yeah, well, and this has always been the thing with Trey. Man, I remember talking about this with you at Hawks games in 2019.
I'm sure we did.
Before we were like wearing masks and having to worry about all of the
true
chaos. But like talking about, okay, what does the team look like long term around someone who's probably always going to be one of the 5 to 10 worst defenders in the NBA? I mean, it's hard to do. It's even harder when your team doesn't have a whole lot of two-way players. I mean, they can put some really good offensive lineups on the floor, and they did this season. Like Gallo, that's why you get him, is because he juices your offense, and he did. But then you're giving a lot of that back defensively, and like
that's the eternal question: is like, can you find 4 two-way players to put with Trae Young, basically?
Right? Which was why, like at the time, the whole like Trae, Herter, Reddish, Hunter, Capella, or Collins, if he turns into a defender, thing was interesting, is because like, okay, you have these 2 potentially really good defensive wings who could also maybe hit a 3 and do some secondary playmaking, and then you can kind of build it out that way around this one. If you just have this one really weak defender, you can cover that up with 4 good to great defenders around him. They have been unable to do that for varying reasons over the last few years, but like to me, like someone like DeLon Wright, who I thought played pretty well against Miami, was one of the few Hawks who played really well. It could be instructive for them, because that seems to be the kind of player that you need next to Trae Young, like just a versatile combo guard with some defensive versatility. I remember talking about like Lonzo Ball like 2-3 years ago as a potential target. Someone like that who can defend either guard spot, maybe do a little bit offensively, but mostly you just have him in there to cover up for Trey defensively. It's just hard to find those guys. And like DeLon Wright, as good as he was against the Heat, probably not good enough to be that guy as a starter next to Trae Young or like as a key rotation player. So it's probably going to be that you end up starting like kind of you either start like someone like Herter, who's okay defensively and pretty good offensively, I think, or you start someone who's really good defensively but can't really do anything offensively at the 2. Like that's probably the formula you have to use because of how bad Trey is. And then you also have to have multiple plus defenders around him. And if Capella is going to continue to decline like he did this season, that's worrying. Gallo is not getting any younger. Collins is fine defensively as a 4, but in this environment, you probably need him to be better than fine if your overall defense is going to be fine. DeAndre Hunter's just always a wild card, both for his injury concerns and also just the inconsistency when he is on the floor. So I don't know. It's the thing that we've always said about Trae Young, but it bears repeating that it's just always going to be difficult when your best offensive player, the guy that you essentially have to build the team around, is that bad defensively. That's always going to place constraints on the way you build out the rest of your roster. And I think for as good as they were offensively this year, the Hawks kind of felt the downside of that in a lot of ways on the defensive end.
Yeah, they definitely did. That's certainly well put. All right, I'm going to ask you in a second how they climb out of this. How they can fix it. Obviously, you can't change the whole roster overnight, but I want to know what you think about what the future might hold. But before we get to that, our final break on the podcast to hear from our sponsors. Today's show is brought to you by Rock Auto. In the auto world these days, there are so many makes and models that it's actually really almost impossible for a local chain store to stock all the car and truck parts that you actually need. And even if they had them, do you actually want to endure the questioning from the person behind the counter? They just want to sell you the brand they want to sell you, and then what happens to the warehouse and just what's easiest for them, to be honest with you. And instead of doing all of that, you have access to rockauto.com at home or in your pocket, and that's a much better option for you at this point. And why spend more? The exact same audio ports from a chain store or a dealership when you order them at rockauto.com, and it's very, very easy on top of that. And rockauto.com is a family business. They have been serving customers for more than 20 years, and the prices at Rock Auto are reliably low for each and every customer, no matter who you are. And they absolutely have everything you possibly need for your car or your truck. That includes brake parts and tail lamps, motor oil, even carpet. And rockauto.com is the place that you need to go for all of the parts available for your car and your truck. And from there, right, locked on when you get there, and they ask you in the box how you heard about rockauto.com. That's where you put the locked on moniker so they know that we sent you to them. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, Ben, let us tackle the question of what to do now, because we talked about a little bit about the offensive issues in the Miami series, the defensive issues overall. Most of the roster is under contract. In fact, 8 of their top 9 guys from this last year are currently under contract. DeLon Wright being the only exception, who they could bring back if they wanted to. He's got bird rights, etc. Gallo is on a weird non-guarantee. May not be back. We'll see, but they can keep him if they want to. Let's say I won't put you in charge of the franchise. That's probably unfair to you, Ben. But what do you think they actually need to do? Because there's this raging debate now about like whether the priority needs to be a number 2 scorer, like I'm not going to throw names out there for now, but a number 2 scorer. Let's just say that after the playoffs, the way that all ended, versus like, do you just need better wings on defense? Do you like want to just move on the margins? Like, there's kind of this debate about whether you need to like overarching change or just like kind of working on the margins, trying to find a 2-way guy somewhere to help the defense, etc. Where do you land? Because it's not always that simple, but like, I guess there's that just raging debate. So I want to know what you think about like the roster for next season and beyond.
Yeah, I get the sentiment behind bringing in a number 2 scorer, probably more than I would have said like a month ago, because of what we talked about in the playoffs. Like you'd probably, you just need some more diversity. And I understand where that's coming from. I still kind of think though, like the resources that it would take to acquire that guy, like what you're sacrificing to bring that guy in, who, by the way, is probably not going to be very good defensively.
Well, and that's the thing where you know me very well, Ben. My antenna is always up. Like, pick whichever one of these guys you want, whether it's Donovan Mitchell, whether it's whoever you want to say. The vast majority of them, perimeter scorers in particular, are not great defensively.
Yeah.
And if you find the guy that is, he isn't available.
Right. Exactly.
It's Jason Tatum, and you can't get that guy.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
So to me, that issue is maybe better solved through coaching and just trying to turn Herter or Bogdan. Because I mean, I think in theory, Herter and Bogdanovich are those guys. I think Herter is an excellent secondary creator. Bogdanovich is not. I had higher hopes for him as a passer early in his career, and he seems like he's just not going to get there.
He's wired as a number 2 scorer because he kind of that's the one good thing about having Madonovich in the current iteration is that he's the only other guy on the roster that's like willing to take shots in a way that number 2 scorer needs to take shots. Like we saw Hunter get really aggressive in game 5, which was actually cool to see, but I don't think that's necessarily something you can bank on. He's not really done that in his career and has not been efficient either. Bogey, if you were trying to find the number 2 guy on the offense on the perimeter, it's been Bogdanovich, both by default and because he's actually willing to do it. So like, yeah, I'm kind of with you. I just don't know what they think internally about that. Like, I feel like obviously Herter's not going to be your number 2 scorer. He could be your second creator sometimes. Maybe they thought Hunter was going to give them more offensively, but like, yeah, it's like you have to put in a lot of chips in. Even if you go like a step below Donovan Mitchell, who's obviously going to cost a lot if they try to get him, and just pick like generic top 50 in the NBA player in the league scorer type, you got to trade 3 or 4 assets to get that guy. And like, where are those assets? Like maybe you trade a Kongwu and keep Capella. Maybe you do whatever you got to do there, but like you're going to have to trade a lot to get that guy and then also create other holes in your roster without being able to fill them. So it's like, you kind of have to have priorities, but internal might be the way to go, particularly if you can find your next, 2-way wing. Because I do have sympathy for people who think that like, look, the wing rotation is not good enough. At least was not good enough this year. I'll say that just plainly as take Reddish out of it, who was their 4th wing for like half the season. But let's just say Herter, Bogdanovich, and Hunter in their current form, particularly in this year's DeAndre Hunter, that isn't going to be good enough to win anything with those 3 guys. It's just not. And they don't have the depth beyond them. So like, I think my broad takeaway would be like, try to improve the wing, but then you get into like, do you want a defensive wing? Do you want a scoring wing? Like, I know you need to be better there. I don't know what the answer is in terms of what you have to actually do to do that.
Yeah, I would lean toward a defensive, maybe not even a wing, but like a guard, like someone who can guard point guards and not get burned, or maybe you go with like an off ball for like a Robert Covington type. And I know the Clippers just traded for him, so they're probably going to want to re-sign him. And Steve Ballmer, I'm sure, will have no hesitations about spending the money to do that.
Well, they had their best moments with DeLon Wright on the floor in the playoffs, and obviously he's not like a starter that you want to play 35 minutes a night, but DeLon Wright did that. Like he gave them that force defensively, like got Trey a little bit easier matchups, all that stuff. And again, like I love DeLon Wright. It's well documented. He's my guy, but like not even I think DeLon Wright should be playing 35 minutes for you.
Yeah.
But like it's not a coincidence that when he was out there in the playoffs is when they actually had their best moments.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I go probably, if it were up to me, I would go down the defensive guard / wing route, just like kind of perusing through the upcoming free agent list. Like Gary Harris is an interesting name if he has anything left. Like that's a guy I thought he ended up not getting bought out, but that I thought could be an intriguing buyout guy for the Hawks when that was, in the news. Yeah. I think that makes some sense as a free agent, and particularly too because, like you said, if you're going to acquire, let's say, a Donovan Mitchell or someone of like maybe below that level, a secondary scorer, those guys cost a lot, like you said. The other types of players, the Gary Harrises, the defensive, the DeLon Wrights, those guys are like almost perennially undervalued on the market. So you can probably pick up one of those guys for not very much and have him make an impact. Now, is it going to be enough of an impact that he's actually moving the needle for you in the playoffs? Maybe if it's that level, you do need to spend a lot of money or a lot of assets or whatever it takes to get him. So I get that. But even then, it still probably costs less to get that guy than it does to get the number 2 scorer. And like I said, when you have Trae Young, I don't think you need like an all-star number 2 offensive player. You just need guys who can do something when playoff defenses take Trae out of what he wants to do. And as I said earlier, I think the Hawks have those guys on the roster. It's just a matter of using them in more creative and more dynamic ways. So to me, it's fairly straightforward, like what the goal should be of the offseason. Who knows how feasible it's going to be, but I think you try to get like a better a rotation forward who can like make plays away from the ball and be a good help defender, because that was one thing in addition to point of attack defense that the Hawks just didn't really have. So like if you can upgrade the Gallo spot into a Covington type, something like that, that makes some sense to me. And just a defensive wing to pair with Trey, not even as a starter necessarily, but just as someone who can play rotation minutes, just a better version of the DeLon Wright role, I guess. Or someone who's just going to more consistently give you what DeLon Wright gave them in the playoffs.
Sure.
But you get what I'm trying to say. I mean, it's those
No,
types of guys that I think they should be pursuing.
Yeah, and I think, just to say it out loud, like, obviously in a perfect world, you would pair Trey Young with Jason Tatum.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like with a 6'8" two-way forward that can play defense and also score. Or obviously a step down from there, Jaylen Brown. Like pick whichever guy you want. That's the player you actually need if you are the Hawks, in my mind, to be a contender.
Mm-hmm.
But that player is so incredibly difficult to get that, like, yeah, if the guy decides he wants to be available and ask for a trade this summer that we're not foreseeing, then sure. But like, that can't be your only plan for next season alone. Like, you can't just say, hold on and trade for that guy. Or like, I've seen recently that, there's Hawks fans that are in love with like trying to get DeAndre Ayton to come. It's like, I know he's a free agent, but like he has to choose Atlanta.
Yeah.
Then he has to sign and trade because you don't have any cap space. Okay. Rudy Gobert is interesting. Like, that's come up. And that's interesting. Like, he's better than Capella, but like, does he really solve all your problems? I'm a skeptic on some level. He would obviously make you better, but a lot of money for a lot of years, etc. So like, and Donovan Mitchell, I've long said I don't love that idea as for two small offense only guards playing together. So yeah, I think that big picture, you probably do need to just hit on something huge, and maybe Jalen Johnson becomes a superstar. I don't know, but like beyond that, you got to try to just prioritize and figure out who's available to you. And because of the team building that you've already done, it has to be on trade. I mean, you're gonna be picking in the middle or late first round picks every year, and maybe you hit a diamond in the rough, but like, you can't expect that. And then you're over the cap forever. Like, you're never gonna be under the cap for a long time. You've committed all this money forever now. So like, you're limited to trades and draft, and your draft picks are more in the modest range. So like, this is the bed you've chosen to make, and you paid that price to speed up a little bit quickly when they kind of pushed their chips in 2 summers ago, and it worked. You made a conference finals with it, but now you have to look at the roster and just like kind of decide what you want to be. And I'm not sure what that is. Like, do they want to move on for Capella? That's another question. Obviously, you talked about it earlier, but eventually they're going to have to choose a center. You don't draft a Collingwood number 6 overall and have him be a 12-minute a game backup for his whole career. That's not going to happen. So like, either you trade him or you trade Capella, or something else happens there. Collins is always on the market, like for 2 straight years now, basically. I don't know what they're going to do, but I know they obviously have to get better on defense, and it certainly would help them to have a better number 2 option. I think this Heat series, to bring it all full circle, was a particularly bad matchup for their offense. Like, if you were drawing up a situation to have the Hawks struggle offensively, it would have been that Heat team. But they still exist. I mean, you had to beat them to get to where you wanted to go, and you couldn't beat them.
I mean, the Celtics are kind of built in a similar mold too. So there are multiple of those teams that could give them trouble.
Yeah, the Celtics certainly defensively. I mean, they don't have. I mean, I almost said they don't have PJ Tucker, but like, they have bigger guys. They have Robert Williams. They have
the defensive player of the year, Brad. They have the best defender in the NBA.
That's bait for me, Ben. I won't do the whole thing about Marcus Smart's being awesome. I want to say that he's awesome. Marcus Smart's awesome.
Great first team all defense caliber defender.
He's a great defender.
Yeah.
He should not have won an award in my mind, but alas. But no, we talked a lot about it, but like, there's the desire, and I get it. There's a desire for a quick fix on this Hawks team to like, what takes them from this to title contender next year. And my answer, when I'm being snarky but also accurate, is like, someone asking for a trade only to Atlanta that only wants to come here. That's a top 10 player in the league. Other than that, like, they can get better, obviously, but I do have a hard time seeing them go from what they were this year to legitimately title level team without something weird that I just cannot see happening in the next year. Like, long term, maybe Hunter makes another leap. Jalen is a guy that finds it. Is that like, they have long term pieces. They have assets. They have an extra pick from Charlotte, all that stuff. But short term, it is a little bit more like incremental. Like, I think you want to be. I think somebody said it at exit interviews. It was like, step 1 is avoid the play-in next year, and it's like, they kind of said it in a laughing way, but it's also true. Like, you just can't be where you were this year. Get back to where you were last year in that 4-5, and then you have something going.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned Hunter. I was going to bring him up, and I mean, maybe he is the 2-way wing. It's not looking like.
I mean, they hope he is.
I do too. I mean, I've always kind of liked him, and I think, I still think he has that in him. It's just, is it ever going to really come out in?
Yeah, he had the great game.
You know?
I know you saw it, but like he had the awesome game 5.
Yeah,
where like he had what was 30 something points, and he was making jumpers and shooting pull ups, and like that. It's one of those times when like it pays off to watch a team every day for a full season. And I don't say this to be negative, but DeAndre Hunter was pretty bad this season. Like for year 3. And he wasn't 100% healthy all the way through. But if you told me that was the player Hunter was going to be in year 3 when they drafted him, I would have told you that was a very bad outcome for this year on the whole. Now, that doesn't mean bailing on DeAndre Hunter. I think he's still a talented guy. He actually shot well from 3 this year. That's a positive thing. But he's got to be better than he was this year. I think he's probably going to get a little bit overrated nationally because of game 5, and people just saw that happen. But like taking a step back and looking at his, I mean, even if you're not a big advanced numbers person, his metrics this year were not kind on the whole. Offensively, he had some interesting moments, let's say. Even defensively, I think he was okay, but he wasn't this great defender this year. So like he has a long way to go, and famously he's not super young. He's 24. He'll be 25 in December. So like he is their best bet at that internally. I think he definitely still has the most upside. Like he has higher upside than Kevin Huerter does. I think Huerter had a better season than Hunter did, which if you polled random NBA observers and asked them who was better this year, Hunter or Huerter, I bet people would say Hunter, and they'd be wrong. Yeah. So it's just interesting to me, but yeah, you're right. I mean, you're hoping if you're the Hawks that he's now healthy going into the offseason. He can develop and make that leap in year 4. And it happens. Sometimes it takes 4 years for guys to get to where they got to go, or 5 years to get where they got to go. And yeah, the internal improvement option, he's the guy. I guess him and Okongwu are the guys that you still circle and say, all right, they still have big time upside. So that's what you have to hope for.
Yeah. No, I agree on all counts with everything you said. If I can put on my Magic Johnson hat for a second here, I think all they need to do, trade for Rudy Gobert, get Jaylen Brown to come home, trade for him,
if they do those things,
Bridges somehow.
Yeah, that's great.
Develop DeAndre Hunter into.
Okay, so that they've gotten Jaylen Brown without trading DeAndre Hunter.
Your problems are solved.
No, it is kind of fun. I'm not trying to pick on fans, and I get it, but I've seen a few of those like off-season plan things on Twitter that have gotten retweeted, and it's always like somehow they end up with Gobert or DeAndre Ayton and Jaylen Brown and somebody else, and it's
That's right.
Do they only have 5 guys? Do they have a bench anymore? Like, if they traded every pick that they have? I'm just confused how they got all these guys. But no.
Has the NBA like gone down to 12 teams?
Listen, there is a scenario where they actually can trade for Rudy Gobert. That's actually quite plausible to me.
I would support that, honestly. I think that makes some sense.
It all depends on what you pay. I mean, I don't think I'm in love with it, but at a certain price, you do it because he makes you better. That's a bad contract. Or maybe not bad. It's a very expensive, that could be bad contract.
It's questionable on the back end.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But then my thing is always, okay, let's say you trade Capella and other stuff, which is what it's going to cost. Capella and other stuff for Rudy Gobert. What's your next move? Because that alone does not make you a contender. My apologies, but Rudy in place of Capella that's an improvement, but that's not going to take you from where you were this year to contender status, because Capella's really good and Rudy's better, but like you have to do something else. That doesn't just fix all your problems. We've already seen Rudy Gobert try to play catch-all for a bad perimeter defense. It didn't go that well in the last couple of years in Utah. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But anyway,
although I think somehow the Hawks' perimeter defense is better than Utah's.
It is. I mean, honestly, in the playoffs, it was better. I mean, we'll call Donovan and Trey a relative wash. Maybe Donovan's slightly better, but I think not by much.
Not by much.
But like when you factor in what they were playing when it came to Mike Conley, who I love, but is kind of done on defense.
Yeah.
And then Royce O'Neal's not getting great shakes. Jordan Clarkson is worse than Kevin Huerter defensively. I'll tell you that right now. So yeah, I think you're actually right. I think Utah is actually worse than the Hawks are
amazingly
defensively outside of Rudy. But that kind of tells you how good Rudy is, I guess, because they were a top 10 defense in the regular season, and that's remarkable. Anyway, we're off the rails, but I do think that the Hawks will do something. That's been my party line. It's like the least sexy answer of all time, and it involves nuance. I think that a guy in the rotation, let's just say a key guy, a core guy, will be traded in the summer. I don't know who it's going to be. I'll tell you, it won't be Trey. But other than that, I think everybody else is available. And that includes Okongwu, that includes Jalen Johnson, whoever else. They're all available. I think Hunter, it probably would be a big deal for him to get traded. Like him being traded for Gobert or something like a star would be the way that he gets traded. But other than that, like I think that they're going to do something else. Running it back after all the comments from Travis Schlenk back to January when he was like, "Why did I pay all these guys on the radio?" And the way that it all ended, and an owner that wants to win or at least wants to get some buzz back in the building, they're going to do something else. But good luck to you finding out what it is, man. If you find out, let me know.
Will do. Yeah, your guess is as good as mine at this point.
I have some guesses, but I will save them for offline. Well, that's all I have on the Hawks front. Unless you have anything else to add on the Hawks, we talked about the Hawks for 40 minutes at this point. But if you have any good color to add, please feel free. If not, please plug yourself. And I thank you so much for all the time.
Yeah, I think I've just about exhausted my Hawks.
You emptied the clip on the Hawks.
Yeah, we emptied the tank here. Similarly, I think my computer is also about to die, so this is good timing.
Good timing for all. Yes.
Yeah, you can follow me writing about the NBA over at the Step Back. Lots of weekly column. Hopefully some good stuff coming out with the playoffs now. Also listen to the Read and React NBA podcast. That's a good. I won't say that myself, but hopefully you find that it's a good
podcast. I enjoy it.
Yeah, a good way to get some analysis and some opinions on the league. So we've been regularly doing those throughout the playoffs, and we'll continue to do so. So you can check both those things out. Usually I tweet them all out. If not, you can just search them and hopefully they'll come up.
Thank you again, Ben, for doing this. I might try to sweet talk you in to come back for some like conference finals talk or finals talk, something like that. I will keep the Hawks burden off of you for the most part. Unless they make a huge move, I will maybe we'll talk again. But you focus on all 30 teams these days more than I do. So thank you for joining me on the podcast. I do appreciate all of that. And just for me to say it out loud, I recommend Ben at the highest level, writing, podcasting. John's just okay. But Ben's fantastic. Hi, John.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
No, thank you, sir. As for everybody else, please subscribe to this podcast. We'll be back again later in the week with more content in some form, as always, and we'll see you next time.